Well, shall we begin, David?
Yeah, let's begin.
Welcome everyone to this session on hot topics, Russian sanctions, what you need to know. And with me today is my friend and colleague, Dave Pentland, Carson International. My name is Dan Kisselback. I'm a lawyer with Miller Thomson, and I practice in the area of global trade. David is a well-known customs broker. On to the next slide, folks. This is not legal advice, so please don't go out and consider it to as advice as to what you should and should not do. If you need legal advice or any other advice, please seek a qualified professional. On to the next slide. David, a little about yourself.
Yeah, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in Canada. Dan, thanks. Always enjoy doing these presentations with yourself. I'm a senior vice president at Carson International. We're a global freight forwarder, customs broker. Have been in the business a long time, and I'm looking forward to today's topics. I'm going to lean on Dan for a lot of this, but my big before we begin is that this is a very fluid situation going on, and I would just caution anybody with their either importing or exporting out of Russia that the information today is current today, but it is evolving. And so reach out to people like Dan if you in fact have to or require further information. So, yeah.
A little about myself. I'm a managing partner in Vancouver and lead the Global Trade and Customs Group. We've got a collection of folks across the country that deal with global trade and customs, and I'm just one of the team. On to the next slide. So this will be the topics covered. I don't plan to get into the nitty-gritty. I view this as a issue awareness kind of presentation so that people can know more about what's going on in this particular area and govern themselves accordingly. We'll talk quickly about sanctions against Russian entities and individuals, the Russian Central Bank and SWIFT actions, export and import restrictions, the removal of Russia and Belarus from the most favored nation treatment, ban on aircraft and ships and vessels, and the response by Russia to sanctions. On to the next slide, please. So, in a nutshell, the Canadian government has a patchwork of legislation that is designed to impose measures, sanctions on Russia arising as a result of the unrest in Ukraine. And one of those pieces of legislation I've mentioned there in bold, the Special Economics Measure, Russia Regulations, it contains what's called a dealings prohibition. Section 3 says something along the lines of, it prohibits any person in Canada and any Canadian outside of Canada from dealing in any property owned, held, or controlled by a designated person. And a designated person is a person that the Canadian government has deemed to be the type of individual that they want to sanction, a Russian oligarch or some sort of important Russian corporation, that type of thing. And what we often see is we get asked for advice. Can we, especially on outbound transactions, sometimes inbound, can we deal with this person? Can we deal in property that is owned or controlled by the person? And it's interesting that the legislation doesn't define own or control. And it's unlike the Income Tax Act, which has very specific definitions, 50% plus one or whatever. Here, the government has, possibly deliberately made it vague. We're seeking advice and some guidance, and we expect to get some policy guidance, but at this particular point in time, it's a bit of a murky area, and all we have are rules of thumb as to how these particular words have been interpreted. There's also a notice to brokers restricting exports to Russia, and of course, the most favored nation treatment, the preferential tariff treatment, has been withdrawn, I should say, effective March the 2nd. So we're left with the higher general tariff, I believe. On to the next slide, please. So Canada imposed restrictions via amendments to the regulations, the Russia regulations. Over 440 Russian individuals have been added, and you have to kind of watch what's going on, because this thing, as David has mentioned, is developing quite quickly, and more people are being added to the list. I don't recall the situation of people being dropped from the list. And then there's 32 key Russian financial institutions and 32 defense agencies. So you have to go through a roster of who's listed, and there is a program that will tell you how much ownership some of these entities have. So it's a bit of a technical job to go through. On to the next slide. There are 2 rounds of amendments to the Special Economic Measure Ukraine regulations, and it's similar. The Ukraine regulations deal with trade and investment activity in the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. And so those regions are also brought into play through these regulations. On to the next slide. So here is the dealings prohibition that I referenced. Section 3 prohibits persons in Canada and Canadians abroad from dealing in any property held by or on behalf of persons and entities. And it's actually, the wording is a little bit different. It's actually owned, held, or controlled by a designated person. So you have to go into that type of analysis. Does the recipient, for example, is it owned, held, or controlled by a designated person? And Section 3 of the Ukraine regulations also contains a dealings prohibition. Next slide, please. So Section 5 of the Russian regulations prohibits Canadians from knowingly, so there's an intention here, of doing anything that causes, facilitates, assists in, or intended to cause, assist, facilitate any activity prohibited by the Russian regulations. So there's a prohibition, and usually when there's a prohibition, there's a penalty for doing something that's contrary to prohibition. That's how these pieces of legislation work. So it's a good idea to try to not contravene the act, especially intentionally. So it's broad, it has broad applicability to any person in Canada and any Canadian abroad. And then, next slide is Russian Central Bank and swift actions. In February, Canada, along with the EU, France, Germany, and other Western countries, made a joint announcement committing to sanction key Russian banks by disconnecting them from the SWIFT system. And the SWIFT system is the global interbank messaging system that allows the transmission of financial information. And it is intended to make financial transactions very difficult. So if you're intending to get money from a customer through that's in a Russian bank, it's very, very difficult now. So that's why it matters. It's extremely difficult for banks to transact with these financial institutions or with financial parties. On to the next slide. Also references the restrictive measures to limit the Russian Central Bank ability to access global currency reserves. And so it's a pretty significant measure. It is intended to really be punitive for Russian business. On to the next slide. There was a notice to exporters and brokers restricting exports to Russia by halting new export permit applications and canceling valid export permits. So if you need an export permit for something, unless it's really an exceptional situation, it's going to be a very, very tough row to hoe. Canada has stopped the issuance of new permits, and I'll pause to say, Canada has a system of export controls that restrict the export of certain sensitive technology as well as goods. And so only persons with certain permits, either a general permit or an individual permit, can generally get permission to export controlled goods. So far as Russia goes, that whole process is being suspended.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that anybody with an annual export permit, they were canceled immediately as of February 24th as well. So there are some people that had annual permits that they thought had beat the deadline, and there was a wiggle around. Those are canceled. So
good point, David. On to the next slide. So Canada had already suspended permits relevant to Belarus. And there are some exceptions. I've noted them there: medical supply chains, specific end uses that are for humanitarian needs. This is dealt with on a case-by-case basis. You have to get a hold of somebody in global affairs to give you special dispensation, basically, to get a permit. And global affairs is there to assist in those kind of restricted situations where humanitarian considerations and compassionate considerations might apply. Next slide, please. Restrictions on oil. There's a prohibition on the supply or importing, purchasing, acquiring from Russia any good in this list of petroleum oils and petroleum gases, hydrocarbons, so forth. On to the next slide. Canada hasn't imported any crude from Russia since 2019, and a limited amount of Russian petroleum products have been imported. On to the next slide. This is was a big one. Folks were trying to get their shipments in under the wire. March the 3rd, 2022, Canada issued the most favored nation tariff withdrawal order, withdrawing MFN treatment with respect to goods originating from Russia. So a rate of 35% is going to apply to goods imported and originating from Russia or Belarus from now going forward. North Korea is the other country whose imports are subject to the general tariff. So it's an exclusive club. This applies for 180 days unless it's extended by Parliament. And so we'll just keep a watch on this. Next slide, please. The air has been closed to international airspace for Russian aircraft operators. We have an open skies type of situation, except for these types of aircraft. Next slide. Similarly, a ban on Russian ships and fishing vessels. Prohibited any person from docking in or passing through Canada, any ship registered in Russia or used, leased, or chartered in whole or in part on behalf or for the benefit of Russia, a person in Russia, or a designated person. Docking and passage is okay, apparently, to safeguard human life or to ensure navigational safety. Next. So there's a handy-dandy link for the list of sanctions. And as I say, it gets updated on a regular basis as the screws seem to be tightening in this particular area. Next slide. Just for interest's sake, what's the Russian response? Export bans, their own special economic measures, allowing the use of patents without permission or compensation to owner, their own airspace restrictions, and potentially nationalizing assets of foreign firms who have decided to take up business in Russia if they leave Russia. Next. So Russia has approved a list of unfriendlies, those territories and states that are taking unfriendly actions, and a creation of a blacklist of individuals banned from entering Russia. Next, please. There is an executive order banning exports of certain goods and agricultural commodities until the end of 2022. And so there's a list of over 200 products, and some include agricultural commodities, and so forth. So there's going to be a restriction of the supply of these types of goods globally. Next, please. Fertilizer is one of those types of commodities, and oil is another one that's being touched upon by the Russian sanctions. Next, please. There have been economic measures imposed which have applied to Russian exporters concerning currency. So there are currency restrictions on the for Russian residents. So getting money out of the country is going to be a bit of a problem. Next, please. Again, these are various economic measures designed to restrict the export, if you want to put it that way, or transfer of certain funds. Certain public companies are allowed to do certain things to facilitate normal business, but it's a difficult situation for most ordinary people and most ordinary businesses. Next slide, please. Again, there are economic measures dealing with the stock market, and I guess not much is going on from Canadians doing business in Russia at this point in time, I would say. Next, please. There is a decree that deals with provision of credits and loans and rubles to restricted persons and transactions related to the transfer of title to securities or real estate. And again, there's a restriction that deals with unfriendly countries. That's countries that have committed unfriendly actions. Next, please. Here, there's a discussion of the export from Russia foreign currency and cash and monetary instruments in the amount exceeding US dollar 10,000, and that's prohibited. So real estate and securities, money, all these types of things you have to be very careful with at this point in time. Economic measures limit USD 5,000 based on an exchange rate per calendar month on transfers by Russian residents to other resident individuals. So internally, business is difficult. And there's a ban on transferring payments on securities to any foreign legal entities and individuals. So the commerce of Russia right now is really tightened right up. Next slide, please. March the 5th, there was a decree establishing a temporary procedure for fulfilling obligations to foreign creditors. And this procedure applies to the fulfillment of obligations exceeding 10 million rubles per calendar month. So these are huge mega transactions. So, you know, I suppose if you have a Russian bond or something like that, there may be an exception that is provided for by way of this decree that allow for the payment of Russian bond interest to investors. But, you know, those types of situations are the exception to what's going on here. Go ahead, next slide. IP rights, there's a decree that basically allows for the confiscation of IP rights, allowing for the use of patents from unfriendly countries with zero compensation and permission from the owner. It applies to patent owners who have citizen on Russia's list of unfriendly countries, or registered in one of those countries, and so forth. So Canada's on the list. We're looking to see if this is limited to just patents or other IP rights. Next slide, please. Russia closes airspace to many countries, including Canada. So this will force airlines to find new routes around Russia. Next slide, please. Nationalizing assets of foreign firms. So if you're doing business in Russia and you decide to pull out, there's a provision which allows for basically Russian administration of your company. So according to the bill, the companies who announced that they were leaving Russia could refuse to go into administration if within 5 days they resumed activity or sold the shares, providing that the business and the employees remained. Otherwise, a court would appoint a temporary administration for 3 months. So you're in a kind of a situation where an administrator is going to be managing the business. Next slide. Various folks are on the blacklist, and including the Prime Minister for Russia.
And just recently, premiers of all the provinces. So.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Your Horgan's on there now.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. So with that, I'll just end with my take on all this wonderful stuff. The situation in Russia is evolving. There is a patchwork of legislation that deals with legislation and policies. Most prominent of this is the Special Economic Measures Act and the Special Economic Measures Act Russia regulations. Key in that is Section 3 of the Russian regulations. Section 3 has a dealings prohibition, and it says to the effect that there is a prohibition against any person in Canada or any Canadian outside of Canada from dealing in any property owned, held, or controlled by a designated person. And a designated person is one of those persons that's listed in the regulations, and that wonderful list keeps on getting larger as days go by. The meaning of owned, held, or controlled is not defined under the act or the legislation. It is unlike other pieces of legislation, such as the Income Tax Act, which will tell you what the meaning of these words are, such as the percentage of ownership. So it's up to legal counsel and the client to determine what is the meaning of these words and what is the level of risk relating to a transaction. Sometimes you may find situations where there is a ownership line and a designated person owns a operating company, which is then owned by a hold company. Do you just go to the operating company and then don't worry about the holding company? These are types of questions you have to ask and answer. And what does ownership mean? Does that mean 50%? Does that mean less than 50% in a widely held company where only one person will own, say, 10% of the shares? So those questions, we hope, will be answered by Global Affairs in the form of a policy statement shortly. We're told it's imminent. If in doubt in this situation, I would suggest to you that it's appropriate to get legal advice on the appropriateness of any particular transaction dealing with Russia. New laws are going to be introduced. Invariably, one new bill is being presented currently that will allow for the Canadian government to seize and forfeit assets, bank accounts, real assets, so forth, that are owned by designated persons, and then realize the value and redistribute that value to appropriate causes, perhaps the victims of the Ukraine war, that kind of thing. So I will end there, and David, I'd turn it over to you to wrap it up.
Yeah, so thanks, Dan. Most of brokers and forwarders' involvement is usually on import-export side. Within our company and companies like ours who are involved in international trade, the word Russia and anything is a full stop within most companies, and it needs to be bumped up the totem pole. So within our company, they would bump it up to myself, and in most cases, I would refer it to a qualified legal team like Miller Thomson, because it's really out of our ballpark. So it really is a full stop, anything to do with Russia these days. and I guess it's pretty clear when you go through the wording that the wording talks about facilitation, involvement, and that would extend to brokers and forwarders. So if we were involved in a transaction that involved Russia and it was against the regulations that are in place now, we would be held liable. So it's just right now it's a word of caution, and if you put the humanitarian side of it, to one side, there's a business aspect to it, but I think everybody is just hoping that there's a peaceful resolution on the horizon sometime soon, and that things get better than they get worse. But I would just say stay tuned and stay informed. So, but I want to thank Dan for all the very informative information today. So thanks again, Dan.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. If you want to get a copy of this presentation, please just send us an email. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye now.